On Mother's Day, my son lifted his glass. "To the woman who's been like a real mother to me," he said. "I wish you were my mom from the start." The words hit harder than any slap. He wasn't looking at me. He was smiling at Kelsey's mother. A velvet box sat open in front of her. "Diamonds, $15,000, maybe more." Everyone leaned in to admire it. In front of me, an envelope, roof maintenance. "Please pay by Monday," Kelsey said. I heard chairs scrape, laughter swell, someone clapping. My own son had just erased me. While I sat right there, I kept my back straight, my hands still. 3 years of bills I covered. Mortgage, utilities, his car repairs. I'd told myself it was helping family. Family, is that what this was? Or was I just the bank that never closed? Brian clinked glasses with her, the sound sharp in my ears. He used to toast me on Mother's Day. Now I was a shadow at my own table. I looked at the bracelet glittering on her wrist. He never spent that much on me in his life. Not even close. Part of me wanted to speak, to demand an answer. But another part, stronger, went quiet. Because I remembered something, the deed. The house was still in my name. Every cent I'd poured into it documented. Let them think I'm harmless. Let them think I'll just keep paying. They have no idea what's coming. I smiled then. Not from joy. Never from that. It was the smile you give when the plan clicks into place. One day soon, Brian will have to look at me. And when he does, he'll see what it costs to throw your mother away. Folks, if your own child erased you in front of everyone, would you walk away? Or take back everything they thought was theirs? I didn't always live on the edge of their world. There was a time when I was the center of it. 8 years ago, I buried my husband. Brian stood beside me, 29, pale and trembling. I told myself we would take care of each other now. The weeks after the funeral blurred. Papers to sign, accounts to close. The house suddenly too big. I sold the second car and kept the older one. Brian came by often then. He sat at my kitchen table talking about the new job. I poured coffee, cut fruit, and listened like it was church. One afternoon, he mentioned a house in the suburbs. "It's perfect, Mom, but we're short on the down payment." I did not even pause before saying, "I'll help you." I cashed out part of my savings. We signed the mortgage together, both our names on the deed. It felt like building something firm under his feet. Then came the credit card debt. A call from Brian, embarrassed and breathless. "It's just until the next paycheck." Though I paid it, and the month after that, and the one after that. When Kelsey's car broke down, my check fixed it. When their heating failed in January, I covered the bill. I told myself this was what family does. The truth hummed under every receipt. Each payment shaved the edge off my own plans. Trips I never took, classes I never tried, a fun thinning. Still, I didn't say no. Not when they were starting out. Not when I believed generosity would keep us close. Sometimes I would write a check and feel a quiet pride. I am useful, I thought. Being needed softened the ache where grief had settled. Boundaries sounded rude in my mouth. Maybe next month tasted like betrayal. So I kept saying yes and called it love. I saved every email and statement without thinking why. Folders filled neatly, dates lined up, my name repeated. Proof of a story I did not know I was telling. Brian still hugged me then. "Thanks, Mom," he would say, quick and warm. I believed those words meant we were partners in life. But small shifts gathered like dust, shorter visits. Fewer questions, more requests. I pretended not to notice and paid another bill. I told myself they were busy. Young marriage, long hours, the usual storms. I could hold the rope for all of us a little longer. What I did not admit out loud was simple. I feared the silence after the word no. I feared learning I mattered only when I paid. So I kept the peace. I kept the receipts. And I kept waiting for gratitude to show up and stay. By the time Mother's Day arrived, the pattern was carved. I was dependable, invisible, and always ready. I did not know the next cut would be public and clean. I missed no one's birthday, no payment dates, no calls. They missed the woman holding the rope for them. Entirely. I sat there long after the laughter faded, my fork tracing circles in the air before landing back on an untouched slice of cake. Every laugh they shared over that necklace rang in my ears like a bell I couldn't silence. It wasn't jealousy. It was something colder, realizing I had become invisible in a life I helped build. I thought back to the nights I paced with Brian's newborn cries, feet aching, eyes gritty, whispering, "Hush, I've got you," until the sun threatened the blinds. To the mornings I packed his lunch while my own stomach stayed empty, telling myself, "You're fine." Lorraine? To the afternoon I signed the papers for his first mortgage, pushing aside the tremor in my hand. Those moments felt like love then. Now they sit like unpaid debts in my chest. The more I remembered, the heavier it became. I saw myself in every faded grocery receipt, in the worn soles of my shoes because I kept saying, "You don't need new ones?" In the careful way I stretched $1 and called it wisdom. Temporary help had turned into a quiet, endless expectation. Brian never asked how I managed. Kelsey never wondered if the light stayed on because I skipped my own doctor's visit. They assumed the money came easily, as if my sacrifices were inked into some invisible contract I had signed at birth. Maybe I let them believe it. Maybe I believed it too. And that somehow cut the deepest. There was no villain in that room, just a comfortable story where I always played the helper. Indifference can bruise harder than a slap. At least a slap admits you exist. I stared at the bill tucked in its little envelope and felt something tilt inside me. A page turning, slow, deliberate. I heard my own voice in my head, steady and strange enough, not the kind that shouts, the kind that closes a door and leaves it closed. I didn't argue. I didn't perform dignity for an audience that wasn't watching. I stood, thanked them for the lovely afternoon, and walked toward the door. My back felt taller. My breath came easier, like I had finally returned to my own body. In the car, I rested my hands on the wheel until they stopped trembling. I thought about the years I spent smoothing chaos, turning disasters into small inconveniences. I thought about the second life I might still have, the one where my worth isn't measured in what I cover. A quiet life. A boundary. A name that belongs to me again. I started the engine, not in anger, in resolve. The kind that doesn't need witnesses, applause, or permission. The kind that lets a woman keep what remains of herself and refuses to apologize for it. Tomorrow, I will make calls, review numbers, and draw lines that hold. Tonight, I'll let the quiet be mine. I'll sleep without rehearsing my apologies. In the morning, they can meet the woman I remember again. It happened 3 weeks after Mother's Day. I was in their kitchen, sleeves rolled up, rinsing plates from the barbecue. Brian had invited friends over. I thought it was a chance to help, to be part of the day. Kelsey walked in, heels clicking on the tile. She didn't look at me, just at the sink full of suds. "Lorraine, could you dry faster? The dishwasher's waiting." Her tone was clipped, like I was the hired help running late. I set the plate down, wiped it carefully. "Of course," she sighed. "And maybe you could take the trash out after? It's piling up." I glanced toward the patio. Lauder spilled in through the screen door. Brian was out there, drink in hand, telling a story. He didn't even look my way. I told myself not to read into it, but the weight in my chest said otherwise. Later, while carrying the trash to the bin, I passed the open window. Kelsey's voice drifted out. "I swear, sometimes she moves like she's 100. Someone chuckled. I froze. Brian murmured something I couldn't catch, but he didn't defend me. Not once. I walked to the end of the driveway, set the bin down slowly. The summer air felt heavy. It wasn't just the words. It was the way they slid so easily from her mouth, as if I wasn't family at all. That night, in the guest room I sometimes stayed in, I sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on. The quilt smelled faintly of lavender. But it didn't comfort me. I thought about the hours I'd spent babysitting when they first moved in. About the groceries I stocked in their fridge when money was tight. About Christmas mornings when I wrapped extra gifts so no one would feel left out. And now I was the slow one, the extra pair of hands, the invisible woman standing over a sink. The next day, I tried to keep my distance. But it's hard when you live close enough for them to drop by. Kelsey arrived unannounced, holding a stack of mail. "These came to our address," she said, setting them on my counter. "Oh, and you might want to forward your magazines somewhere else. They clutter the foyer." She smiled thinly, already halfway to the door. "See you when we see you." I stood there long after she left, staring at the envelopes. My name, my handwriting, still mine, even if they wanted to push me to the edge. That night, lying in bed, I replayed her words. The sting wasn't in the chores or the errands. It was in the way she made me feel like a guest who had overstayed her welcome in a life I had helped build. And somewhere deep inside, a part of me that had stayed quiet for years began to stir. It was a Friday night when the line I had been tiptoeing around finally snapped. Brian had invited neighbors over for drinks. I brought a plate of bruschetta, thinking it might be nice to contribute. The living room was warm with chatter, glasses clinking, and the faint hum of music from a speaker on the counter. I set the plate on the coffee table. Kelsey swept in, immaculate in a cream blouse, holding a fresh tray of appetizers. She glanced at mine and gave a little laugh. "Oh, you made these? That's sweet. We'll put them in the kitchen." Don't want to crowd the real food. Several heads turned. A couple of people smiled awkwardly. My hands stayed at my sides, but I could feel the blood in my face. I forced a small nod. Sure. She took the plate without another word and disappeared into the kitchen. I stayed standing, the noise of the room suddenly too sharp. Conversations rolled on, but I caught the sideways glances. I wasn't sure if they pitied me or agreed with her. When I finally sat, I kept my eyes on my lap. Brian came over once, patted my shoulder, and asked if I wanted another drink. I shook my head. He didn't linger. An hour later, Kelsey called out from the kitchen, loud enough for everyone. Lorraine, would you mind taking the recycling out?
It's kind of your specialty, right?
Laughter followed. Quick, light. The kind people use when they think a joke is harmless. But it wasn't harmless. It was deliberate. It was a gentle shove toward the role she'd decided for me, the help, the extra, the one who tidies up while the real family entertains. I walked to the kitchen, lifted the bag, and stepped outside into the cool air. The night smelled faintly of rain, the kind that never quite falls. I stood there a long moment, bag in hand, listening to the voices inside. They blended into a low, distant hum, like a radio left on in another room. I remembered when Brian was small, how I would defend him against teasing at school, tell him he was more than other people's opinions. Now he stood on the other side of the glass, not lifting a word in my defense. I emptied the bag, came back in and quietly collected my purse. No goodbyes, no explanations. I just left. The porch light followed me down the walk, but the voices never stopped. Driving home, I didn't cry. The tears had dried somewhere between the recycling bin and my car door. What remained was something steadier, colder. The kind of stillness you feel before a decision hardens. That night, in my kitchen, I placed my keys on the counter and stared at the quiet space around me. No one here to dismiss me. No one here to assign me a role I didn't choose. I realized I had one advantage they didn't see coming. I had kept every document, every proof of the part I played in their security, and I was done letting them treat me as if I had none. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. Brian's voice was brisk, businesslike. Hey, Mom, can you swing by tonight? There's some paperwork we need to get done. No explanation, no small talk, just a summons. When I arrived, Kelsey greeted me at the door with a folder in her hand. We'll make this quick, she said, smiling in that way that wasn't really a smile. Brian was at the dining table, pen poised. Papers spread out like an appointment he'd been waiting on all day. What's this about? I asked, setting my bag down. Just a couple of forms for the mortgage, Brian said, sliding a stack toward me. Refinancing stuff. It'll lower the payments. I flipped through the pages. The print was dense, numbers bleeding into more numbers. Why does it list me as the sole guarantor on this section? I asked. Kelsey leaned forward. It's just legal language. You've already been helping with the payments. This just makes it cleaner. Her tone was too smooth, rehearsed. I glanced at Brian, but he avoided my eyes, flipping his pen between his fingers. Something cold moved through me. I'm not signing until I read all of it, I said. Kelsey exhaled sharply. Lorraine, this is time-sensitive. We've already lined up the bank appointment. If we miss it, the rate goes up. I picked up the top sheet and scanned it again. A date caught my eye, last month. My name was on a withdrawal authorization from our joint account, $10,000. I had not signed it. I set the paper down slowly. When did this happen? Brian finally looked at me. It was an emergency. The roof. I thought you said the insurance covered the roof. I cut in. He shrugged, shifting in his chair. Most of it. Not all? Kelsey crossed her arms. Look, it's done. This is about moving forward. My pulse thudded in my ears. They'd taken money in my name without telling me, and now they wanted more. My signature, my security. I leaned back, folding my hands in my lap. I'll take these home. My lawyer can look them over. Kelsey's mouth tightened. That's not necessary. We're family. I held her gaze. Exactly. Which is why you should have told me before touching my account. The silence stretched. Brian pushed his chair back, the legs scraping the floor. Do what you have to do, he muttered. I gathered the papers into the folder, tucking it under my arm. The air in the room felt heavy, almost humid. My own home was 10 minutes away, but it had never felt farther. At the door, Kelsey called after me. If we lose this deal, it's on you. I didn't answer. Outside, the evening was cooling, the street lamps just starting to hum. I gripped the folder tighter. Inside was proof of their reach, their assumption that I would bend because I always had. Not this time. I set the folder on my kitchen table and made tea, though I knew I wouldn't drink it. My hands were steady, but my mind was running like a machine that wouldn't power down. I opened my laptop and logged into the bank. The numbers blinked on the screen, too neat for what they hid. There it was, withdrawal 10,000, marked as authorized. The date matched the paper in the folder. My signature was nowhere near it. I clicked back 3 months. More withdrawals. Smaller amounts, 2,000 here, 500 there, all labeled with vague descriptions. Home repair? Miscellaneous expense. Each one lined up with weeks when Brian or Kelsey had mentioned some minor issue around the house. I had believed them every time. I sat back, staring at the screen. It wasn't just the money. It was the story they had been building without me, the quiet rewriting of who controlled what, of whose name meant access. I pulled a yellow legal pad from the drawer and began writing dates, amounts, and any matching notes I could remember. I wrote until my hand cramped, then I opened the folder and compared each sheet to my list, circling the ones that matched exactly. Patterns emerged. Every large withdrawal coincided with a sudden urgent expense, just before a family gathering or holiday. The clock crept toward midnight. My tea was cold and touched. I didn't feel tired, just sharper, as if every slight from the past year was fitting into place. I got up and went to the filing cabinet in the hallway. I pulled out old mortgage statements, receipts, even text printouts from Brian and Kelsey asking for help. Just this once. I spread them across the table until the wood disappeared under paper. The mess looked overwhelming, but to me it was a map, proof of a path they thought I wouldn't see. Somewhere in the stack was the first check I'd written for their house. My name stood bold on the line. That house was never just theirs, no matter what they wanted to believe. I reached for a pen and wrote EVNC on the front of the folder in block letters. Beneath it, the date. I slid the bank printouts and my handwritten list inside. This was no longer about trust. It was about ownership of my money, my signature, my place in this story. When I finally stood, the house was silent. Outside, the streetlight cast a pale square onto the floor, and in that light the papers glowed faintly. I felt a strange calm. The shock had burned away, leaving something solid. I locked the folder in the cabinet, turned the key, and slipped it into my pocket. It felt heavier than it should, but in a way that grounded me. I knew then that I wouldn't be caught unprepared again. Tomorrow I'd make an appointment with the bank, and after that, a lawyer. Tonight, I would let the quiet settle and remember that the only permission I needed now was my own. The invitation stopped almost overnight. 1 week it was, "We're having friends over Saturday. You should come." The next, nothing. My phone stayed on the counter, screen dark, except for the occasional promotional email or reminder to pay a bill. At first, I told myself they were just busy. Summer was always full of events, cookouts, trips, school sports. But then I saw the photos. Kelsey posted them online, Brian at a backyard barbecue. Their friends crowded around the grill, a cake with "Happy Birthday, Dad" and frosting. I hadn't even known it was happening. The sting wasn't in missing the party. It was in knowing they hadn't wanted me there. Days grew long in a different way when no one expected you. I filled them with small tasks. Watering the plants, organizing the linen closet, making soup I didn't really want. The quiet was thick, not peaceful, the kind that reminds you how easily you can be erased. Only Emily reached out. She was my granddaughter, 14 and already taller than me. One afternoon she called, "Grandma, can I come over? Mom's busy and Dad's in the garage." I smiled before I could stop myself. "Of course, sweetheart. Anytime." When she arrived, she dropped her backpack by the door and went straight to the kitchen. "Do you still have that peppermint tea?" We sat at the table, steam curling between us. She talked about school, her art project, how the cat had gotten into her room and knocked over a plant. But halfway through, she stopped, eyes on her cup. "Grandma, are you okay? You don't come over as much." I hesitated. "I've just been giving your parents some space." Her mouth twisted. "They're being weird. I don't like it." I reached across the table, resting my hand over hers. "Sometimes people change how they treat you. It's not always about you. Sometimes it's about them." Her eyes searched mine, as if she knew there was more I wasn't saying. But she didn't push. Instead, she squeezed my hand back. After she left, the house felt quieter, but not in the same empty way. For a little while I had been seen. Heard. That night I made myself sit with the silence instead of filling it. I let the memories come. Holidays where I set extra chairs, birthdays where I stayed late to clean so no one else had to. I had thought those gestures would bind us. Instead, they had become invisible, absorbed into an expectation. Now I understood being left out wasn't an accident. It was a slow redraw of the family picture, until my spot faded altogether. I turned off my phone before bed. If they wanted to reach me, they could try harder. And if they didn't, well, I was beginning to see that my worth wasn't hanging on their invitations anymore. The following week, I saw them at the farmer's market. I had gone early, basket on my arm, hoping to pick up fresh tomatoes. Turning a corner between stalls, I spotted Brian and Kelsey ahead, Emily trailing behind with a paper bag. They were laughing with another couple, strolling as if the morning belonged only to them. For a moment, I considered walking over. Then Kelsey glanced my way. Our eyes met. She gave a polite nod, no smile, before turning back to her conversation. Brian didn't even notice me. Or maybe he did and chose not to. I stood there long enough for the vendor to ask if I was in line. No, I said quietly, stepping aside. My appetite for tomatoes was gone. Back home, I checked my phone. The family group chat used to buzz with updates, Emily's grades, new recipes, reminders for gatherings. Now it was bare. My last message, sent 3 weeks ago, sat unanswered between a string of photos I hadn't been tagged in. I scrolled until the screen blurred, then set it down. The silence wasn't accidental anymore. It was curated, Emily called that evening. "Grandma, can I sleep over this weekend?" "Of course," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll make pancakes in the morning." When she arrived, she dropped her shoes at the door and plopped onto the couch. "It's so quiet here," she said, half a sigh, half a smile. We watched an old movie together. Halfway through, she rested her head on my shoulder. "Mom says you're taking time for yourself," she murmured. I laughed softly. "That's one way to put it." She tilted her head up. "I think they're wrong." I brushed her hair back, my throat tightening. "Thank you, Emily." Later, when she was asleep in the guest room, I sat in the kitchen with the lights low. The house felt different when she was here, like it remembered how to be warm. But the minute she left, it would go back to its new normal quiet, deliberate distance. I poured myself a glass of water and stared at the folder still locked in the cabinet. Proof of withdrawals. Proof of my stake in their house. Proof that I hadn't imagined any of it. Part of me wanted to confront them immediately, to break the silence with facts they couldn't twist, but another part knew timing mattered. Let them believe I was retreating. Let them underestimate me. Before bed, I wrote Emily a note to slip into her backpack. "You are always welcome here. No matter what." It felt important for her to carry something I couldn't always say out loud. When the house went still again, I lay in bed listening to the hum of the fridge, the faint tick of the clock. The loneliness was sharp, but underneath it, something else was forming. An outline of the woman I used to be before I let their needs consume mine. And I knew, with a quiet certainty, that they hadn't pushed me out. They'd pushed me into a place where I could finally see them clearly. The invitation arrived as a text from Brian. "Come by Saturday night, just a small gathering." I stared at the message. It was the first in weeks. Part of me wondered if this was a peace offering. Against my better judgment, I decided to go. When I stepped into their backyard, strings of white lights hung over the patio. People milled about with drinks in hand, music low but lively. Brian waved from the grill, tongues in hand, as if nothing had been wrong. Kelsey, in a fitted emerald dress, was moving between guests like a hostess in her element. I found an empty chair near the edge of the patio. The night air was warm, scented faintly with charcoal and cut grass. For a few minutes, I let myself believe I was welcome again. Then Kelsey's voice rang out. "Everyone, can I have your attention?" She stood near the center, holding up a glass of wine. "I want to thank all of you for helping us make this house a real home." She gestured toward a long wooden table, newly refinished. "This was such a big project for us, took months to save up. But it's worth it, right?" Lauder and nods followed, then she looked straight at me. "And thank you, Lorraine, for keeping the kitchen clean so we could focus on this instead." The crowd chuckled, the polite, uncomfortable kind. My cheeks burned. I forced a smile, but inside, something recoiled. The phrasing wasn't casual. It was a deliberate reminder of where she thought I belonged, in the background, doing the work no one else wanted. Brian laughed, shaking his head as if she were just teasing. "You're terrible," he told her, but didn't look my way. I stood, murmuring something about getting water. In the kitchen, I set my empty glass on the counter and took a deep breath. My reflection in the window looked older somehow, but also steadier. That's when I noticed a stack of mail on the counter, partly covered by a dish towel. The top envelope was from the county property office. My name was printed alongside Brian's on the address label. I didn't touch it, just took in the sight, the quiet reminder that I wasn't the invisible servant Kelsey wanted me to be. This house wasn't just theirs, no matter how they played it for their friends. When I returned to the patio, the music had shifted softer, and the conversations had splintered into smaller groups. Kelsey caught my eye, smiling sweetly, as if to check whether I was still stung. I sat back down, hiding my calm behind a polite nod. They could laugh at me in front of their guests. They could paint me into a corner role. But they couldn't change the facts written on paper, facts I was more than willing to use when the time came. I stayed in my seat, sipping water slowly, letting the chatter wash over me. It was almost a game, seeing how invisible I could make myself while still catching every word. At the table behind me, Brian sat with a man I didn't recognize. They spoke low at first, but the music dipped and snippets floated over. "Just need a co-signer to finalize?" the man was saying. "The bank will approve by Monday." Brian chuckled. "Not a problem. She's already on the paperwork for the house, so it's basically done." The man hesitated. "You're sure she'll agree?" Brian's voice dropped, but not enough. "She won't even know until it's over." I kept my expression neutral, eyes fixed on the twinkle lights overhead. The words slid into place with everything else I'd learned over the past weeks. They were planning to leverage the house. My house, too, without my consent. Kelsey swept past with a tray of empty glasses. "Everything okay here?" she asked them, her tone light but her eyes sharp. When Brian nodded, she glanced toward me and moved on, not realizing I'd heard. I excused myself and went back into the kitchen, pretending to look for napkins. From the doorway, I could still hear them talking numbers. Loan amounts, interest rates, a timeline that was moving faster than I'd guessed. I found a pen in the drawer and quietly wrote the date and a few key phrases on a scrap of paper from my purse of co-signer finalized Monday. I slipped it into the inner pocket of my bag. Another piece of evidence. Another line in the map I was drawing. When I returned outside, someone had lit the fire pit. Guests gathered closer, their faces lit in flickers of orange and gold. I took a seat at the far edge, where the shadows hid my expression. Emily spotted me and came over, perching on the arm of my chair. "You're quiet tonight?" she said softly. "Just listening," I told her. She smiled. "You always notice things other people don't." I squeezed her hand. "That's a good habit to keep." As the night wound down, guests began to leave in clusters. Brian clapped a few backs. Kelsey handed out leftover cupcakes in small boxes. No one mentioned the jab she'd made earlier. Maybe they thought I'd forgotten. I hadn't. When it was finally my turn to say goodbye, Kelsey gave me a quick hug, perfumed and hollow. "Thanks for coming," she said. "It meant a lot. I met her eyes." "It did," I replied, letting her hear the double edge. Back home, I placed my bag on the table and pulled out the scrap of paper. The handwriting was small, but the meaning was big. They thought they could move money in my name without me noticing. They thought public humiliation would make me shrink. Instead, it had clarified things. I now had both motive and proof. I locked the paper in the same folder as the bank statements, the withdrawal list, and the mortgage documents. Then I sat back, a slow smile forming. They'd chosen to make me invisible. They'd forgotten that people are most dangerous when you stop watching them. If you were in my place, humiliated in front of a crowd, then handed proof your own family was plotting behind your back, would you confront them now, or wait until the perfect moment to strike? The next morning, I woke with my mind already moving. I didn't bother with breakfast. The folder went straight into my bag, along with the scrap of paper from the night before. At the bank, the lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and printer toner. I walked up to the counter, where a young teller in a navy blazer greeted me with a bright, neutral smile. "How can I help you today?" "I'd like to review the mortgage and any related documents for my property," I said. My voice was calm, but firm enough that she didn't ask unnecessary questions. She typed on her keyboard, then glanced at her screen. "I'll have to bring in our loan officer for that. Can you wait a few minutes?" "Yes," I said, settling into one of the leather chairs by the wall. My bag rested on my lap, my hand over it like a shield. A man in his 50s approached, wearing a pinstriped suit and reading glasses. "Mrs. Carter?"
I'm Daniel.
"Let's step into my office." Inside, I laid out my request again. Daniel nodded and pulled a thick folder from a locked cabinet. "Here's your file," he said, sliding it across the desk. I opened it carefully. The first few pages were familiar: loan approval, closing statement, the deed with my name right beside Brian's. But halfway through, my stomach tightened. There was a new document, dated just 6 weeks ago, stating amendment to ownership terms. My signature was at the bottom, except it wasn't. The loops in the O were wrong. The Carter lacked the pressure I put on the T. It was close enough to fool someone who didn't know my hand, but I knew. I looked up slowly. "Daniel, can you tell me when this was added?" He frowned. "Our records show it was signed here in person." "By you? That's impossible," I said evenly. "I haven't been in this office in over a year." He leaned back uneasy. "If you'd like, we can initiate a signature verification process." "Yes," I said without hesitation. "And I want a copy of this document today." He made the copy himself, slipping it into a manila envelope. "You'll get a call from our compliance department," he added. "It could take a couple of weeks." I nodded, tucking the envelope into my bag. "Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate your time." Outside, the air felt sharper. I sat in my car, staring at the traffic but seeing only the neat, forged letters of my name. This wasn't carelessness on Brian and Kelsey's part. It was planning. Back at home, I added the envelope to my growing evidence file. Bank withdrawals, mortgage documents, the overheard conversation from the party, and now, proof of forgery. My hands didn't shake as I closed the folder. If anything, I felt steadier than I had in months. They thought they could move quietly around me. They hadn't realized I could move quietly too, in a direction they wouldn't see until it was too late. And when that day came, it wouldn't be an argument or a plea. It would be a fact they couldn't undo. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with the manila envelope open in front of me. The forged signature stared back like a challenge. I studied every curve and slant, committing it to memory. One detail stood out in Daniel's words. He said the document was signed in person, which meant someone had vouched for me being there. I called the bank asking to speak with Daniel again. "Just one question?" I said when he picked up. "Who was working the front desk the day this amendment was filed?" He hesitated, then replied, "That would have been Kara. She's one of our senior tellers." The name didn't ring a bell. "Does she know my daughter-in-law, Kelsey?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. There was a pause, and then a careful, "They've spoken before. I believe Kelsey's been in here with her a few times." That was enough for now.
Thank you, Daniel,
I said, ending the call. I jotted down the name Kara, front desk, on a slip of paper and placed it in the evidence folder. If Kara had knowingly witnessed a forged signature, she was part of this. If she'd been duped, that was still leverage. The next step was clear. I reached for the worn leather address book that had sat in my drawer since Martin passed. Flipping through, I found the number I hadn't dialed in years. Robert Harris, the attorney who had helped Martin settle his estate. He had a sharp mind and a sharper sense of loyalty. He picked up on the second ring. "Lorraine Carter? Well, this is a surprise." "I wish it were a social call," I said. "I need legal advice. And discretion." "You've got both. What's going on?" I told him about the forgery, the overheard conversation at the party, the quiet withdrawal of my place in the family. His voice stayed steady, but I could hear the weight of his attention. "You're right to come to me," he said when I finished. "Do not confront them yet. Every move they've made suggests they think you're unaware. That ignorance is your advantage." "I've been keeping records," I told him. "Every transaction, every conversation. It's all here?" "Good. I want copies. We'll get a handwriting expert to verify the signature, and we'll put a temporary freeze on any changes to the property title." That last part loosened something in my chest.
How long will that take?
"By tomorrow," he said. "And Lorraine, don't let on that you've spoken to me." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, feeling the steady thump of my heartbeat. It wasn't rage anymore. It was clarity. They had built this scheme in the shadows. Now I was turning on the light. I placed Robert's business card on top of the folder, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this. Emily didn't know it, but I was fighting for her future too, making sure she saw what respect and boundaries looked like. As evening fell, I locked the folder away. The house was quiet, but the silence no longer felt like exile. It felt like strategy. They thought they were setting the stage for my exit. They didn't realize I was building the groundwork for theirs. I couldn't sleep. The red digits of the clock glowed 20:17 a.m., casting a faint light over the ceiling. My mind refused to quiet. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my forged signature, looping in a stranger's hand. I turned onto my side, the quilt Martin and I bought on our 25th anniversary pulling around my shoulders. He'd always said I carried too much on my back. Bills, favors, obligations. And that one day it would weigh me down enough to break me. You have to protect yourself. Lorraine, he told me once, sitting at this same kitchen table, his coffee cooling between us. Even from the people you love. Especially from them. Back then, I'd brushed it off. I thought love meant safety, and safety meant trust. But now I understood he hadn't been warning me about strangers. He'd been warning me about moments exactly like this. I stared at the ceiling, counting the breaths between the ticking of the clock. The house felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums until you hear your own heartbeat. On the nightstand sat the folder, my evidence. I'd moved it from the locked cabinet to within arm's reach. Maybe it was paranoia, but I wanted it close, like a lifeline. The papers inside were more than proof, and were the bones of my plan. In my mind, I began arranging the steps. First, Robert would freeze the title changes. That bought me time. Second, I'd have the handwriting expert's report in hand before Brian or Kelsey suspected anything. Third, I'd quietly route certain payments that still tied me to their bills, leaving them to feel the weight they'd assumed I'd always carry. I could almost hear Martin's voice, calm and certain. Don't rush it. You're holding the better cards. Let them think they're winning until it matters. I rolled onto my back, watching the faint outline of tree branches sway across the ceiling from the streetlight outside. The image reminded me of a chessboard, pieces in motion, some visible, some hidden. I had been a pawn in their game for too long. Now, I intended to be something else entirely. A car passed slowly down the street, headlights sweeping across the wall. I thought of Kelsey's smirk at the party, the certainty in Brian's voice when he told that man I wouldn't know what they were doing. The sting was still there, but it no longer hollowed me out. It fueled me. By the time the clock crept past 3, the tight coil in my chest had eased into something steadier. I knew what I was going to do, and more importantly, I knew what I wasn't going to do. No angry confrontations, no begging for decency. When I finally drifted toward sleep, it was with the knowledge that each day forward would be a quiet step toward the moment I turned their own game against them. And when that moment came, there would be no mistaking who had truly been in control all along. By morning, the plan had stopped feeling like an idea and started feeling like a checklist. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. First on the list was the joint utility account I'd been paying for years. I logged in, clicked through to the autopay settings, and quietly removed my bank information. It took less than a minute. No email to them, no announcement. Just the silent removal of my name from the balance sheet. Next, I went through my own accounts, flagging every recurring payment connected to their mortgage, car insurance, even the internet service at their house. Each one was a thread binding me to them. One by one, I cut them. The phone rang mid-morning. It was Emily. "Grandma, are you busy?" "Not for you," I said, smiling into the receiver. She told me about a school project, her voice warm and unguarded. It reminded me why I was doing all this, not out of spite, but to draw a line they could never cross again. I didn't tell her about the forgery or the lawyer. She didn't need to carry that weight. After we hung up, I pulled out a different folder, one I hadn't opened in years. It held the titles, deeds, and certificates for everything Martin and I had owned together. I spread them out on the table, checking each one for accuracy. My name was there, unaltered, on the cabin we'd bought upstate, the savings bonds we'd tucked away, the small piece of land Martin had inherited from his father. Every document I verified tightened the net I was weaving. The more I knew exactly what was mine, the less they could twist. Around noon, I drove to the credit union where I kept my personal savings. I requested a statement of all current holdings and asked about setting alerts for any inquiries on my accounts. The teller, a woman about my age, leaned in and said, "You can also place a watch flag. It will notify us if anyone tries to open something in your name." I agreed immediately. Back home, I stored the fresh stack of documents in the locked cabinet. The day's work had been simple on the surface, just a few clicks, a few signatures, but it shifted the ground beneath them. They wouldn't notice right away. That was the point. As evening came, I made dinner for one, the quiet of the house no longer feeling like absence but like ownership. The hum of the refrigerator, the click of the heater, everything was in my name under my control. In the past, I would have called Brian to remind him about a bill or to offer to pick up something they needed. Tonight, I did nothing. Let them wonder. Let the first missed payment arrive without warning. I washed my plate, dried it, and placed it in the cupboard. Small actions, steady hands. That was how I'd move from here on out. Quietly, deliberately, until the moment came to show them exactly what I'd been building. The pieces were in motion now, and they wouldn't stop until they landed exactly where I intended. The first thing I did that morning was clear the dining table. It became my war desk, papers stacked in neat piles, each labeled with a sticky note. Bank, utilities, property, communication. I started with the bank statements. Every transaction involving Brian and Kelsey went into its own file. Payments I'd made, cash withdrawals they'd requested, even the emergency transfers that never came with a thank you. Seeing the numbers lined up like that was like reading the slow bleed of my own trust. Next were the emails. I scrolled through years of subject lines. Need a favor? Quick question. Can you cover this? I printed the most telling ones, highlighting the parts where they assumed my help before I'd even agreed. Those words would speak louder than any argument I could have. For the text messages, I took screenshots, careful to capture the timestamps. There it was, Kelsey texting me at 10:42 p.m. about a bill due tomorrow, followed by Brian's "Don't worry, Mom will handle it" to someone else. They had built a rhythm around my reliability, one they thought was permanent. By mid-morning, I had 3 full folders, each one thick enough to feel satisfying in my hands. But evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed to control access. I called Robert. "I'm ready for the next step," I told him. His voice was steady. "Then we start by securing your accounts. No one, family or not, should have authority over your finances without your consent. I've removed my information from their bills," I said. "What's next? Any joint accounts you don't absolutely need, close them. For the ones you keep, change the passwords and security questions." After we hung up, I opened my online banking. Every password became a random string only I knew. The security questions shifted to answers no one could guess. My mother's maiden name. Not the real one. The name of my first pet. I made it up. Then came the utilities tied to my name at their address. I called each company, explained I was removing myself from the account. Some asked why. "Just simplifying things?" I said, keeping my tone light. By noon, I'd locked down everything they could touch. My accounts were now a closed loop, no loose ends dangling for them to grab. I stepped outside for air, the winter chill biting at my cheeks. Across the street, Mrs. Donnelly was shoveling her walkway. She waved, and I waved back, my face calm. Out here, I was just another neighbor enjoying a brisk day. No one needed to know that inside, I was dismantling a quiet empire they'd built on my back. Back inside, I placed the folders in my locked cabinet. The sound of the key turning was more than security. It was a promise to myself. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was leading. I brewed a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the bare branches sway. Somewhere in town, Brian and Kelsey were going about their day, believing the ground beneath them was steady. They had no idea I'd already started pulling it out from under them. The beauty of quiet work is that no one notices it until it's too late. And by the time they did, everything they'd taken for granted would be gone. The next morning, I woke with a single thought: today is the day I seal the doors. I started with the credit union. In person, everything felt more tangible. The branch manager, a woman named Teresa, led me into her office. I explained I needed to update account authorizations. "Only my signature from now on," I said. She typed, printed, and slid the forms across the desk. I signed each one with deliberate strokes. When we finished, she said, "No one else can touch these funds now, Mrs. Carter." "Not without a court order?" That was the first lock turned. From there, I drove to the county clerk's office. Robert had already filed the preliminary hold on my property titles, but I wanted certified copies in my possession. The clerk handed me the stamped documents, the official seals pressing faint ridges into the paper. I ran my fingertips over them like Braille. Solid. Unaltered mine. Next was the bank where Brian and I once shared a small account for house expenses. I closed it completely. The teller's eyebrows rose. "Any particular reason?" she asked. "House expenses aren't my concern anymore," I said, smiling politely. By midday, I'd visited 3 offices, signed 9 sets of documents, and cut off every formal avenue they could use to reach my money or property. All that was left were the intangible threads: email access, document sharing, the little permissions I'd once given without a second thought. Those too I began to revoke. Back home, I opened my laptop and went through every shared file. Mortgage scans, removed. Insurance forms, downloaded then deleted from the shared drive. I even checked the cloud storage I'd forgotten about. Sure enough, Kelsey had access. Not anymore. By late afternoon, the air in the house felt different, like the quiet after a storm. Nothing had changed outwardly. The photos on the mantel were the same, the ticking clock unchanged. But the structure of my life, who could enter, who could take, had been rewritten. Robert called as the sun was setting. "Everything's in place," he said. "From this point forward, they can't move a cent or a title without you knowing." "Good," I replied. "That's how it should have been all along." He hesitated. "Lorraine, be ready. When they realize what's happened, they'll come to you." "I'm counting on it," I said. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea, looking out at the street. My neighbors went about their evening, unaware that inside this house, I'd shifted an entire balance of power. I thought about how easy it would have been to confront them weeks ago, to shout, to demand explanations, but that would have given them time to recover. This way, when the truth hit, it would be final. The folders in my cabinet were no longer just evidence. They were the history of my generosity and the proof of their disregard, and now every avenue they had relied on was gone. As the streetlights flickered on, I felt the first real sense of relief in months. Not joy, not yet, but relief. They had built a life on the assumption that I would never close my doors. Today, I locked every one, and when they come knocking, they'll find out exactly what that means. What about you? If someone in your own family betrayed your trust and lived off your kindness, would you cut them off quietly or confront them head-on? I'd love to hear your thoughts. I woke before the alarm, the house still wrapped in pre-dawn silence. This was the day. The final pieces would fall into place before the sun set. In the kitchen, I brewed a pot of coffee and laid out the checklist Robert and I had finalized 2 nights ago. 3 items. That was all that remained between me and absolute control over what was mine. The first was the joint safe deposit box at the downtown bank. It had been opened years ago for family documents, but somewhere along the way they'd slipped in things of theirs and taken things of mine. I arrived as soon as the bank opened, signed the access log, and had the box moved entirely into my name. When the attendant asked if I wanted to remove anything, I nodded. Inside, I found my original will, Martin's life insurance papers, and a folder with property appraisals. Those went straight into my tote. The second item was a final sweep of every utility and service still connected to my name. Over the past weeks, I'd cut most of them, but today I called the cell phone provider. "Remove my line from this family plan," I said. The representative tried to upsell me to keep me on a different plan, but I declined. No shared accounts. No shared anything. The last was less tangible but just as important, my email. Years ago, I'd set up a shared inbox for biz and receipts. Brian had access, and that was a thread I refused to leave dangling. Back home, I logged in, changed the password, and set up 2-factor authentication linked only to my phone. When the prompt came up asking if I wanted to log out all other devices, I clicked yes, without hesitation. By mid-morning, the list was complete. Every connection, every access point, every door closed. I sat at the dining table with the tote at my feet, the weight of the documents a physical reminder of the ground I now stood on. Outside, the day had turned bright, the kind of clear winter sun that makes everything look sharper. I poured another cup of coffee and allowed myself a slow breath. It wasn't victory yet, not until the confrontation happened, but for the first time in years, I felt ahead instead of behind. Robert would call later to confirm the filings had gone through. Then, there would be nothing left for them to take without my say-so. I thought about Brian's easy confidence, Kelsey's smug little smirk. They had no idea the world they thought they controlled was about to shift under their feet. Today wasn't about revenge for the sake of it. It was about balance, about ending the quiet theft of my trust, my money, my peace. And before this day ended, they would know exactly what I had done, and why. By early afternoon, the call came. Robert's voice was calm but carried the weight of finality. "It's done, Lorraine. Every filing has been processed. Every authorization strip. They have 0 legal access now." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. "Thank you, Robert. This is the part where you hold your ground," he said. "They'll be upset, maybe even furious. but they can't undo what's been done without a fight they can't win. When I hung up, the house felt different. Not just secure, ready. I walked slowly through each room, noticing details I hadn't in months. The worn edge of the dining table where Martin used to sit. The sunlight pooling across the living room rug. This was my space, my life, reclaimed inch by inch. If they were coming, and they would, this would be the place I faced them. No cafes, no neutral ground. Here, surrounded by the evidence of my years of giving, they would have to confront the truth. I began setting the stage without even realizing it. The dining table, cleared except for 3 neatly stacked folders.
Utilities?
Transfers, in each the proof of what I'd paid, how often, and how unquestioningly. Next to them, the certified copies of deeds and titles, each bearing my name in crisp ink and embossed seal. On the sideboard, I placed a pot of coffee and 2 clean mugs. Not to play hostess. Those days were over, but to make sure there were no excuses to leave before the conversation was over. As I worked, the clock's ticking seemed louder than usual. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and paused. My face looked calmer than I felt, but there was a firmness in my eyes I hadn't seen in years. Memories flickered in and out. Brian as a boy, bringing me wildflowers from the yard. Kelsey, the first time she shook my hand, all polite charm. I let the images pass without clinging to them. The people walking into my house now were not the people in those memories. By late afternoon, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the living room. I turned on the lamp by Martin's old chair, its warm glow spilling toward the table. The stage was set, all that remained was the waiting, and the certainty that when they arrived I would not falter. My phone buzzed. A message from Brian? We need to talk? Tonight. I typed back only 2 words. I'll be here. The house settled into an unusual stillness, the kind that precedes a storm. Every document, every decision, every quiet step over the last weeks had led to this. When they walked through that door, they'd be stepping into a different world. One where I held the keys, and they no longer had a claim to anything beyond what I chose to give. And I was done giving. The knock came just after 7. Firm. Impatient, I didn't rush to the door. When I opened it, Brian strode in first, Kelsey a step behind, arms crossed. He didn't bother with a greeting. "What's going on, Mom?" "The bank called me. Said I'm not authorized anymore." "What did you do?" I motioned toward the dining table. "Sit down." "Both of you?" Kelsey smirked. "We don't need coffee, thanks. We just need you to fix whatever mistake you've made." I sat opposite them, the 3 folders between us. "There's no mistake." O'Brien frowned. "Then explain why I can't access our accounts. Why the utility bills came back in our name only." "Because they're your bills." I cut in. They always were. I opened the first folder and slid a stack of statements toward him. Mortgage payments, going back years. My checks, my transfers, every month, without fail. Next came the utility records. Just electric, water, all covered by me, even after you promised to take them over. Finally, the transfers. Every time you said it was an emergency, I gave you what you asked, and you treated it like an allowance. Kelsey's eyes narrowed. "We thought you wanted to help. You never said no?" I leaned forward. "Not saying no doesn't mean I agreed to be your safety net forever. I helped because I believed you were building a life, not draining mine." O'Brien pushed the papers back, his voice rising.
So what now?
"You just cut us off without warning. This is the warning," I said. "Every account you've touched is now secured. Every document is in my possession. You can't take out loans against my name, can't use my credit, can't claim a single thing without my consent." You Kelsey's face flushed. "You can't just—" "I can." I interrupted. And I have. The room went quiet, the only sound the clock ticking steadily in the corner. Brian glanced at Kelsey, but she didn't meet his eyes. The weight of the moment pressed in, making the air feel heavy. "You think this will fix things?" Brian asked finally. "No," I said. "It will protect me. Whether or not it fixes our relationship is up to you." I gathered the folders and stood. "You have your own house, your own income. Live on it. I'm done carrying the weight for you." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Brian stood abruptly, muttering something under his breath. Kelsey followed, her heels clicking against the hardwood. At the door, I added, "When you're ready to talk without expecting a handout, you know where to find me." I closed the door behind them and leaned against it, the silence that followed deeper than any I'd felt in years. They would leave angry, confused, maybe even desperate. but they would leave knowing one thing with absolute certainty. The era of taking me for granted was over. The house was still warm from the confrontation, though the front door had been closed for nearly an hour. I hadn't moved from the spot where I'd stood after seeing them out. The quiet wasn't the soft kind. It was dense, like the air after a thunderstorm. I finally crossed to the table and gathered the folders, stacking them neatly before carrying them back to the cabinet. Each one slid into its place with a satisfying click of the lock. That sound felt final, not cruel. Just necessary. In the kitchen, the coffee I'd made earlier sat cold in the pot. I poured it out, rinsed the carafe, and set it upside down on the rack. Small motions, grounding motions. I wasn't shaking, but there was an undercurrent running through me, part relief, part fatigue. Through the window, I saw the street lamps casting light across the sidewalk. A couple walked their dog, chatting quietly. Life was still going on out there, untouched by the storm I'd just weathered. That realization loosened something in my chest. My world had shifted, but the larger world hadn't even noticed. That, in its own way, was comforting. I walked into the living room and sat in Martin's old chair. The cushion had molded to my shape over the years, and I leaned back, closing my eyes. My mind replayed the moment Brian's face changed, from certainty to disbelief, then to something I couldn't quite name. Maybe fear, maybe realization. Kelsey's expression had been sharper, defensive to the end, but there had been a flicker there too. Perhaps the first hint that my boundaries were real this time. I didn't expect an apology. Not now, maybe not ever. What I did expect was peace, and I could feel the first traces of it settling in. The house felt more like mine than it had in years. Not because they were gone, but because I had finally reclaimed it. On the coffee table sat a small photo frame, one I hadn't noticed in weeks. It was from Brian's high school graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling. I picked it up, studied the younger versions of us. We had no idea then how tangled life would become. I set it back down gently. The past could stay where it was. My phone buzzed once. No call. Just a notification from the bank confirming the account closures. I marked it as read without opening the details. The decision was made. There was nothing left to review. A log cracked softly in the fireplace, the sound reminding me of winters when Martin and I would sit here, talking about everything and nothing. That's the kind of quiet I wanted to get back to, not the heavy, unspoken quiet of resentment, but the shared quiet of trust. I glanced at the clock. It wasn't late, but I felt the day in my bones. This was the kind of tired that came after lifting something heavy for far too long and finally setting it down. Tomorrow, I would start thinking about what came next. But tonight, I would let the silence be a balm instead of a burden. The next morning, I woke without the weight of someone else's demands waiting for me. No phone buzzing before breakfast. No unspoken obligation hanging over my head, just the steady hum of the refrigerator and the faint chirp of sparrows outside. I made coffee slowly, savoring the small ritual. As it brewed, I opened the back door and stepped onto the porch. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth from last night's rain. For the first time in years, I realized I didn't have to rush anywhere I didn't want to be. Inside, I took a legal pad from the desk and drew a line down the middle. On the left, I wrote what I'm done with. On the right, what I want next. The first list filled easily, covering bills that aren't mine, being treated like a backup plan, saying yes out of guilt, waiting for respect that never comes. I underlined each one twice. The second list took longer. I wanted to travel again, maybe not far at first, but somewhere I chose. I wanted to take a pottery class like I'd always talked about with Martin. I wanted to wake up without my stomach tightening at the thought of another call asking for little help. And I wanted to give on my own terms, to people or causes that mattered to me. By mid-morning, I'd begun clearing the guest room. It wasn't for guests anymore, not the kind who came to take. I stacked extra linens in the closet, boxed up old holiday decorations, and opened the windows wide. The breeze carried a faint warmth as if spring was leaning in early. At noon, I drove to the bank to store the most important documents in a new safe deposit box, one registered solely in my name. The clerk handed me the key, and I held it for a moment before slipping it onto my own keyring. That small piece of brass felt heavier than it should. Heavy with ownership, with the knowledge that I was no longer shared property. On the way home, I stopped at the small cafe downtown. The waitress, a woman my age with laugh lines deepened by years of smiles, asked if I wanted my usual. I told her I was trying something new. When the cappuccino arrived, I took the first sip and thought, This is what it feels like to make a choice simply because it pleases me. Back at home, the afternoon light poured into the kitchen, painting everything gold. I sat at the table, my lists beside me, and felt a quiet resolve take root. The confrontation had been necessary, but these hours filled with decisions that were mine alone, this was the start of something better. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be without bumps. Brian might call, Kelsey might show up. There might be words left unsaid, apologies never given. But I also knew I wouldn't step back into the role they'd carved out for me. Tomorrow, I'd start on the first thing from my want next list. For tonight, it was enough to feel the house breathing with me again. Lighter, freer, and entirely my own. 2 weeks after the confrontation, the house no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like mine. Every corner, every creak in the floorboards, every familiar smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. I had started small, but each day carried me further from the version of myself who lived under constant obligation. The first thing I crossed off my want next list was the pottery class. The studio was only a few miles away, tucked behind a row of brick shops. On my first morning there, my hands trembled slightly as I shaped the clay, not from nerves but from the novelty of doing something purely for me. The instructor, a man with patient eyes and clay dust on his jeans, said, "Let the wheel carry you. Don't force it." I smiled, realizing how much those words applied to more than pottery. In the afternoons, I walked the trail near the lake. The winter chill had lifted, and the water reflected the sky in perfect blues. Once, I would have felt guilty for spending time like this, telling myself there was always someone who needed something from me. Now, I knew the only permission I needed was my own. I also began sorting through the old boxes in the attic. Not to discard my past, but to reclaim it. I found letters Martin had written during our early years, still smelling faintly of his cologne. I read them by the window, letting his voice in those words remind me that I had been loved well once, and that love had taught me how to stand on my own. One afternoon, I drove to the local community center to volunteer. Not for recognition, not for repayment, but because I wanted to be part of something that built people up instead of wearing them down. I signed up to help with the literacy program, and as I left, the coordinator pressed my hand warmly. "You're going to make a difference here?" she said. That meant more than any gift ever could. Every evening, I returned to a house that no longer carried the echo of expectation. I lit a candle, cooked something simple, and ate at the dining table without feeling like I was waiting for someone else to join or take. There was a sweetness in that solitude, a sense that my life had grown wider even as my circle had grown smaller. For the first time in a long time, I could see the shape of my future clearly. It was built on my terms, painted in colors I chose, and it belonged to no one but me. Spring arrived quietly, almost shy, as if it knew I needed the gentlest of changes. The lilac bush in my yard began to bloom, and every time I passed it, the scent pulled me back to the Mother's Day that had started it all. But now, the memory didn't sting. It simply marked the place where my story had shifted. One evening, I stood on the porch with a mug of tea, watching the sun dip low over the rooftops. I thought about the woman I had been just months ago, worn thin, too polite to protect herself, carrying burdens that were never mine to bear. I could see her clearly, but she felt like a distant relative, someone I used to know. What I carried now was different. It wasn't anger, though there had been plenty of that along the way. It was clarity. The kind that comes from drawing a line and knowing it will hold, because you've chosen to hold it yourself. I began writing a letter, not to Brian, not to Kelsey, but to myself. I listed the truths I didn't want to forget, that love without respect is just dependence in disguise, that giving should come from choice, not obligation, that boundaries aren't walls, but doors you control the key to. When I finished, I folded the paper and placed it in the same safe deposit box that held the rest of my reclaimed life. The community center had become a steady part of my week. Teaching adults to read had given me something I hadn't realized I'd been missing, a sense of impact that wasn't tied to money or family politics. One of my students, a grandmother herself, once said, "It's never too late to take back your story." I smiled at her words, knowing how true they were. On the first warm Saturday of May, I hosted a small gathering, not for family, but for the people who had supported me through this quiet rebuilding. Friends from the pottery class, a few volunteers from the center, even my neighbor who'd shoveled my walk without asking that winter. We ate on the porch, the lilacs heavy with blossoms, and I realized my table had never felt fuller. As the evening wound down, I stepped inside for a moment and looked around my home. It was the same space, yet nothing about it was the same. Every object, every corner, felt like a choice I'd made, not an expectation I'd met. If someone out there is listening, feeling invisible, taken for granted, I want you to hear this: you are not alone. The path back to yourself may be quieter than you expect, but every step you take is worth it. And when you get there, you'll know. The life you build for yourself is the one that lasts. The lilacs swayed in the night breeze, their petals falling onto the porch boards. I let the door swing open, carrying the scent inside.